The king abandoned his wife, believing she was barren. 7 years later, he finds her with triplets. A warm spring breeze carried the scent of cherry blossoms through the grand cathedral of Virginia's capital. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor where King George VI of Virginia stood waiting for his bride. His sapphire-blue eyes, the unmistakable genetic marker of the royal bloodline that had never failed in 500 years, surveyed the assembled nobility with quiet determination. "Your Majesty," whispered Lord Chamberlain at his side, "there is still time to reconsider. The royal council's concerns are not without merit." George's jaw tightened. At 32, he had grown weary of the council's interference in his personal affairs. "The decision is made, Lord Chamberlain. I will have Eleanor Parker as my queen." The Chamberlain's lips pressed into a thin line. "As you wish, Your Majesty." From his position near the altar, Duke Edward Thompson watched the exchange with keen interest. As the king's distant cousin and third in line to the throne, Edward had cultivated a careful image of loyal devotion to the crown. Yet beneath his pleasant exterior churned ambition that had only grown stronger with each passing year. "A reckless choice," muttered Lord Fairfax beside him. "The Parker line may have noble blood, but they've been impoverished for generations. And that strange girl with her herbs and potions. Now, Edward interrupted with a practiced smile. "Let us not judge too harshly. Our king has always had unconventional tastes." The cathedral doors swung open, silencing all whispers. Eleanor Parker stood framed in the doorway, her copper hair catching the light like a living flame. Unlike the elaborate gowns typically worn by royal brides, Eleanor had chosen a simpler dress adorned with embroidered medicinal flowers, a nod to her renowned skill with healing herbs. As she began her walk down the aisle, the Duke studied her carefully. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her beauty. Pleasant enough, but not the stunning appearance one might expect to bewitch a king. What then had drawn George to this woman, against all counsel and tradition? The answer came when Eleanor's eyes met the king's. Something electric passed between them, a connection so palpable that even the most skeptical courtiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. George's face, normally composed and regal, transformed with naked adoration. Love, Edward thought with distaste. How inconvenient. The Duke's hand unconsciously moved to the inside pocket of his formal coat, where a small vial of clear liquid rested, imported from the Far East at great expense. The rare toxin had properties few Western physicians could identify. For now, it would remain unused, a contingency for the future. The ceremony proceeded with all the pomp 5 centuries of tradition demanded. When asked to speak his vows, George's voice rang clear and confident through the cathedral. Eleanor's response was softer, but no less firm, her strange amber eyes never leaving the king's face. "I present to you His Majesty, King George VI and Her Majesty Queen Eleanor of Virginia," announced the Archbishop. The assembled nobility applauded with varying degrees of enthusiasm. As the royal couple made their way back down the aisle, Edward stepped forward with a deep bow. "Your Majesties, may your union be blessed with happiness and," he paused significantly, "fruitful with many strong heirs." George clasped Edward's shoulder with genuine affection. "Thank you, cousin, your support means a great deal." Behind them, Lady Amelia Stuart, Edward's beautiful young niece, curtsied deeply to the new queen. Eleanor smiled warmly at the girl, unaware that Amelia's seemingly innocent eyes absorbed every detail of her appearance for later report to her uncle. At the wedding feast that evening, Edward observed the curious dynamics of the court. Half the nobles seemed determined to win the new queen's favor, while the other half maintained a polite but noticeable distance. "They say she cured Lord Bedford's consumption with nothing but tree bark and flower petals," whispered one courtier. "Witchcraft more likely," muttered another. "My sources tell me she was found as a child wandering alone in the woods. Who knows what strange blood runs in her veins?" Edward filed away these rumors for future use. Superstition could be a powerful weapon in the right hands. As the night progressed, the Duke made his way to the royal table, offering another toast to the couple's health. King George, already flushed with wine and happiness, pulled Edward close. "I know what they say, cousin," he murmured, "that I must have a son, that my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather each had only one male heir to avoid succession disputes. They call it the royal curse, or blessing, depending on who's speaking. He glanced lovingly at Eleanor. "But I married for love, not merely for succession." Edward's smile never faltered. "A wise king balances both heart and duty, Your Majesty. I'm certain you and the lovely queen will be blessed with many children." Later that night, alone in his chambers, Edward unfurled an ancient genealogical chart of the royal family. His finger traced the line of succession. The king, then the king's childless brother, William, sickly since birth, then himself, so close to power, yet still too far. He uncorked the vial from his pocket. Holding it up to the candlelight, the liquid caught the flame's glow, shimmering with deceptive innocence. "Patience," he whispered to himself. "The game has only just begun." In the royal bedchamber, Eleanor carefully arranged dried lavender and chamomile beneath their pillows, an old tradition from her youth to bring peaceful sleep and fertile dreams. George watched her with fascination. "My council fears you," he said with a soft laugh. "They think your knowledge of plants and remedies unnatural." Eleanor turned to him, her expression serious. "All knowledge can be feared by those who don't understand it. Plants can heal or harm. It depends on the intention of the one who uses them." George pulled her into his arms. "And your intentions, my queen? To heal. Always to heal." She rested her head against his chest. "And to give you happiness for all our days together." Outside their window, a late spring storm gathered on the horizon. Thunder rumbled in the distance, an omen that some of the more superstitious courtiers would later claim foretold the troubled years ahead. But for that night, at least, the king and his herbalist queen remained wrapped in the protective cocoon of newfound love, unaware of the poisonous plans already taking root in the heart of the court. 5 years had passed since the royal wedding, and the palace halls that once buzzed with whispers of a royal heir had grown ominously quiet. Queen Eleanor moved through the royal gardens at dawn, gathering herbs while dew still clung to their leaves. Her slender fingers worked methodically, selecting only the freshest specimens for the king's morning tonic. "Your Majesty should not trouble herself with such tasks," said Hannah, her loyal lady-in-waiting. "There are gardeners for this purpose." Eleanor smiled, tucking a sprig of mint into her basket. "Some medicines require a healer's touch from the moment the plant is harvested, Hannah. Besides," she added, glancing toward the palace, "I find peace here among growing things." Peace was increasingly hard to find within the palace walls. With each passing month without news of a pregnancy, the pressure mounted. Eleanor had seen the disappointment in George's eyes, though he tried valiantly to hide it. In his private chambers, King George VI suppressed a cough as he reviewed state documents. At 47, he looked closer to 60. His once robust frame had grown thin, and the sapphire eyes that marked his royal lineage were now dulled with constant pain. "Another dose, Your Majesty." Duke Edward approached, carrying a small silver tray with a crystal vial. "The Queen's remedies do little good these days," George muttered, running a hand through hair that had prematurely silvered. "Perhaps Her Majesty's talents have their limitations," Edward suggested delicately. "This tincture from the royal physician might provide additional relief." George downed the liquid with a grimace. Unknown to him, the tincture contained carefully measured amounts of arsenic and other toxins, enough to weaken him gradually without raising suspicion. "You are fortunate to have such a dedicated cousin, Your Majesty," said Lord Fairfax, who had joined the Duke Edward as a trusted advisor. "Many in your position would be more concerned with their own ambitions than the welfare of the crown." Edward bowed his head modestly. "The king's health is my only concern. Speaking of which, I've taken the liberty of arranging a special council meeting this afternoon, given Your Majesty's condition. Certain contingencies must be discussed." George's eyes flashed with momentary fire. "I am not dead yet, Edward." "Of course not, sire. But 5 years without an heir. Enough." George raised a trembling hand. "I'll hear no more of this today." After the king dismissed them, Edward and Lord Fairfax walked slowly down the corridor. "He grows weaker," Fairfax observed quietly. "Yes," Edward agreed, "but not quickly enough, and that herbalist queen still commands his heart. The court grows restless. Many are beginning to wonder if she's barren. Or worse, if she's deliberately preventing conception to extend her influence." Edward stopped, looking thoughtfully out a window that overlooked the royal gardens where Eleanor still gathered her herbs. "An interesting theory. Perhaps it deserves exploration." That night, Edward visited his niece Amelia's chambers. "Tell me, dear niece, has the Queen requested any particular herbs recently? Anything unusual?" Amelia, who had secured a position as one of the Queen's ladies through her uncle's influence, thought carefully. "She prepares a special tea each morning and evening. I've seen blue cahosh and black hellebore among her supplies." Edward's eyes narrowed. Though no herbalist himself, he had studied enough to recognize fertility herbs. So the Queen was indeed trying to conceive. This complicated matters. Later that week, Edward gained access to the Queen's private herb room during a state dinner, moving silently among the neatly labeled jars and drying racks. He found what he sought: Eleanor's personal store of prepared remedies for the king. From his pocket, he withdrew a small packet containing an exotic white powder, his most expensive and insidious poison yet. Unlike the slow-acting toxins he gave the king, this rare oriental poison specifically targeted a woman's womb, preventing conception without apparent illness. With practiced precision, he added the powder to several of the Queen's prepared remedies. As an afterthought, he also contaminated her personal tea blend. "Let the court whisper of barrenness," he murmured. "Soon enough they'll demand a queen who can produce an heir." 3 months later, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her complexion had taken on an unsettling pallor. Her monthly courses had become increasingly irregular, sometimes absent for months, then returning with debilitating pain. "Something is wrong," she whispered to herself. Her healer's intuition had been screaming warnings for weeks, but she couldn't identify the cause. The strange symptoms matched no illness she recognized. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Hannah entered, her face tight with concern. "Your Majesty, the Duke requests permission to enter. He says it's a matter concerning the king." Eleanor nodded wearily. Edward entered with his customary bow, respectful on the surface, yet somehow lacking genuine deference. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty. I merely wish to inquire if the king's new remedy is prepared. His pain was most severe this morning." "Yes, of course." Eleanor gestured to a small bottle on her work table. "Please tell His Majesty I'll join him shortly." Instead of taking the bottle and leaving, Edward lingered, his eyes moving calculatingly around the herb room. "You seem unwell, Your Majesty. Perhaps you should rest while I deliver this to the king." "I'm quite capable," Eleanor began, but a wave of dizziness interrupted her. She steadied herself against the table. Edward stepped forward as if concerned, deliberately bumping the work table. Several bottles teetered. He caught all but one, which shattered on the stone floor. "How clumsy of me," he apologized, bending to clean the mess, while Eleanor's attention was diverted. He swiftly replaced the king's remedy with a doctored version from his pocket. That evening, Eleanor decided to personally observe the king taking his medicine. She had grown increasingly suspicious of the pattern of his illness, improving slightly when she administered remedies directly, worsening whenever others delivered them. She arrived at the king's chambers earlier than usual, slipping in quietly through the side entrance. Voices from the king's study made her pause. Through the partially open door, she saw Edward holding a vial up to the light. Adding something to it from a small packet, the realization struck her like physical blow. She must have made some sound, for Edward turned sharply. Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding. Predator recognizing that prey had finally sensed the trap, Eleanor fled, her mind racing. She needed proof, time to think, but time was the one thing Edward couldn't afford to give her by morning. The palace was in uproar. The Duke had presented the king with evidence of the Queen's treachery. Forged letters suggesting Eleanor planned to poison George and rule as regent. Paid servants testified to suspicious activities, and Eleanor's own irregularly documented herb supplies were presented as proof of nefarious intent. George, weakened by months of actual poisoning and manipulated by his trusted cousin, ordered a hasty trial. Eleanor's pleas fell on deaf ears, her explanations dismissed as desperate lies. The court that had always viewed her healing arts with suspicion now saw their darkest fears confirmed. "Eleanor Parker, once Queen of Virginia, you are hereby stripped of all titles and sentenced to perpetual exile," George pronounced, his voice hollow with betrayal and grief. "You will depart for the Northern Territories within 3 days, never to return on pain of death," as guards escorted her away. Eleanor caught Edward's eye. His expression held triumph, but also something else. A flash of fear. He had won this battle, but recognized an adversary more dangerous than anticipated. In her chambers, now stripped of royal insignia, Eleanor collapsed into Hannah's arms. "He's poisoned the king," she whispered. "And me as well. I'm certain of it. But why? What does he gain?" The answer would come later that night, in the form of unexpected discovery and a storm that would change everything. Rain lashed against the palace windows as Eleanor hastily packed a small bundle of possessions. The storm seemed fitting, nature's fury matching the tempest in her heart. Her hands trembled as she reached for her most prized herbalist journals, then hesitated. Any obvious healing tools would make her too recognizable. "My lady, hurry," Hannah whispered, keeping watch at the door. "The guards change in 10 minutes, that's our window." Eleanor nodded, tucking a small pouch of essential seeds into her bodice instead. She would rebuild her collection wherever fate took her. A wave of dizziness struck suddenly, forcing her to grip the bedpost for support. "The poison weakens you," Hannah said, concern etching her kind face. "Are you certain you can travel?" "I have no choice." Eleanor steadied herself. "Besides, I made a discovery tonight that changes everything." Earlier, while searching the royal library for information on the symptoms she'd been experiencing, Eleanor had stumbled upon an ancient scroll tucked behind newer medical texts, written in an Eastern script. It contained illustrations of the very toxin she suspected Edward had used, a rare poison called Barren moon. The scroll detailed its use in ancient harems to prevent unwanted pregnancies without killing the victims. But the poison had yielded an unexpected side effect. For the past 6 weeks, Eleanor had attributed her irregular cycles and morning sickness to the toxin's impact. Now she recognized the truth. She was with child. The poison had failed in its primary purpose, though its presence still threatened both her and the baby's survival. As if responding to her thoughts, another secret made itself known. Eleanor doubled over, clutching her abdomen as nausea rolled through her. "My lady!" Hannah rushed to her side. "I'm carrying the king's child," Eleanor whispered, wonder and fear mingling in her voice. A child conceived despite Edward's poison. She straightened, new determination hardening her features. "I will not go to the Northern Territories to die quietly as Edward expects." "Hannah, do you still have family in Silver Bay?" Hannah nodded. "My sister runs the village inn. She would hide you without question." "Then that's where we'll go. Fetch your cloak." And Eleanor paused, crossing to her medicine cabinet. She removed a false bottom, revealing a small stack of gold coins and a weather-worn map. "My father's emergency fund. He always said a healer should prepare for sudden flight. How little I understood his wisdom until now." 30 minutes later, 2 hooded figures slipped through the servants' entrance and into the storm-drenched night. The usual guards had been lured away by a cleverly staged kitchen fire, Hannah's final service to the palace before joining her mistress in exile. They navigated the capital's winding streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Eleanor's face might be recognized. By dawn, they had secured passage on a merchant vessel bound for coastal settlements, including Silver Bay. Mary and Ruth, sisters from the capital, Eleanor told the ship's purser, using the false identities they had prepared. "Traveling to join our ailing mother." The man barely glanced at them, more concerned with sheltering his ledger from the persistent rain. "Departure at high tide. Find space where you can. It'll be crowded with this weather." Huddled beneath the ship's meager shelter, Eleanor withdrew the ancient scroll she had stolen from the library. "If I understand these symbols correctly," she whispered to Hannah, "the poison remains active in the body for months. It explains why I still feel its effects." Her hand moved protectively to her stomach. "The pregnancy will be dangerous, perhaps impossible to sustain." Hannah squeezed her hand. "You are the finest healer in Virginia, if anyone can counter this poison. It's you. I pray you're right." Eleanor watched the palace's distant spires disappear into the stormy horizon. For this child is not just an heir, it's living proof of Edward's treachery. Their journey to Silver Bay took 8 grueling days. The small coastal village, nestled between pine forests and the gray Atlantic, appeared through morning mist like a vision from another world. Simple wooden structures lined the crescent-shaped harbor that gave the settlement its name. No grand palaces, No courtly intrigue, just fishing boats, salt-weathered cottages, and the promise of anonymity. Hannah's sister Martha welcomed them with few questions. Sensing their need for discretion, she established them in a small cottage at the village edge, spreading word that her widowed sister Ruth had returned home with Mary, a skilled midwife seeking a fresh start. Midwife, Eleanor questioned when Hannah explained their cover story. Best to explain your knowledge of herbs and healing without raising suspicion, Hannah replied practically. Besides, a village this size likely has need of such skills. Hannah's instincts proved correct. Within weeks, Eleanor, now known to all as Mary, had attended her first birth in Silver Bay, earning the community's gratitude and acceptance. Yet her own pregnancy remained hidden beneath loose dresses. Her increasingly frequent bouts of weakness attributed to lingering grief for her deceased husband. As autumn painted the forest in brilliant hues, Eleanor's condition became impossible to conceal. Her belly grew rounder while her face grew thinner, the battle between life and poison taking visible toll. She spent long hours studying the Eastern Scroll and experimenting with native plants that might counteract the toxin. "The child fights," she told Hannah one night, feeling movement beneath her palm. Strong and stubborn, like its father, Hannah didn't miss the flash of pain in Eleanor's eyes. Despite everything, she still loved George. The betrayal had wounded her deeply, but hatred remained beyond her gentle heart's capacity. Winter descended with brutal force. Snow isolated Silver Bay from neighboring settlements, and Eleanor's health deteriorated alarmingly. By January, she was confined to bed, drifting between consciousness and fevered dreams. Only the occasional robust kicks from her womb assured her the child still thrived. Martha enlisted the village's oldest woman, Grandmother Willow, to help attend the failing mother-to-be. The ancient woman's eyes widened when she first examined Eleanor. "This is no ordinary pregnancy," she pronounced, placing weathered hands on Eleanor's distended abdomen. "I feel not one life, but several." Hannah and Martha exchanged alarmed glances. "Impossible," Hannah whispered. "The poison has met something stronger," Grandmother Willow finished. "This mother carries 3 lives within her. 3 fighters who refused death's invitation." The labor began during the worst blizzard in living memory. For 36 hours, Eleanor hovered between life and death, her screams rising above the howling wind. Hannah wept as she wiped her mistress's brow, certain they would lose both mother and children. Then, as the storm broke at dawn, the first cry pierced the cottage. A tiny girl with a shock of copper hair emerged into Grandmother Willow's waiting hands. Before Eleanor could even hold her firstborn, contractions resumed with renewed intensity. "Another comes," the old woman announced, amazement in her voice. By midday, the miracle was complete. 3 identical girls, small but perfectly formed, nestled beside their exhausted mother, Eleanor, pale as the snow outside but smiling through cracked lips, examined each precious face. "Madison," she whispered, touching the firstborn's cheek. "Taylor, to the second. And Penelope, to the third." Hannah gasped when Eleanor gently turned each infant, revealing their birthmarks. "My lady, look." Each girl bore a mark in the exact shape of Virginia's royal crown. Madison on her shoulder, Taylor on her wrist, and Penelope directly over her heart. "The mark of the royal bloodline," Eleanor murmured. "But I've never heard of it appearing as a birthmark. Nor 3 royal children born at once," Hannah added, awe in her voice. "It's unprecedented, as is surviving that poison." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of mingled joy and sorrow. "These girls were meant to live, Hannah, meant to thrive despite everything aligned against them." She gazed at their identical faces, already showing hints of George's sapphire eyes. "They are my proof, my justice, and my future, all at once." Outside, villagers whispered of the miracle triplets born during the great storm. Inside the humble cottage, a deposed queen held her daughters close, unaware that the very poison intended to prevent their existence had somehow broken the royal curse of single heirs, creating instead a miracle that would one day change the kingdom forever. King George VI sat motionless at the great oak table as the royal council debated around him. 7 years had passed since Eleanor's exile, yet her absence still felt like an open wound. The once vibrant monarch now resembled a withered oak, his frame gaunt, his movements slow, his sapphire eyes clouded with pain, both physical and emotional. "Your Majesty must consider the future of Virginia," Lord Fairfax insisted, his voice cutting through George's wandering thoughts. "Queen Amelia has been a dutiful wife, but after 6 years of marriage without an heir..." George raised a hand to silence him. "Enough. My brother William remains next in line," Duke Edward Thompson, now visibly gray at the temples but no less calculating, stepped forward. "Prince William's latest illness has left him bedridden, sire. The physicians give little hope for recovery." This news stirred George from his apathy. William, his younger brother who had always been frail, was the kingdom's last defense against Edward's ascension to the throne. "I wasn't informed," George said sharply. "I instructed the physicians not to trouble your Majesty with distressing news," Edward replied smoothly. "Your own health has been so precarious of late." George's eyes narrowed slightly. In recent months he'd begun to notice patterns. How his symptoms worsened after meetings with Edward. How the Duke seemed to anticipate each decline in his condition. Suspicions had taken root, though still shapeless and unconfirmed. "I wish to see my brother today." "Of course, sire." Edward bowed, frustration flashing briefly across his features. "Though the journey to his country estate would be taxing in your condition." "Then have him brought here," George commanded, a rare flash of his former authority returning. After the council adjourned, Queen Amelia glided into the chamber. 7 years as George's second wife had transformed the once innocent girl into a polished royal figure. Her exquisite beauty remained untouched by time, her elaborate gowns and jewels displaying the taste and wealth expected of Virginia's queen. "You seem troubled, husband," she said, placing a delicate hand on his shoulder. George sighed. "The succession weighs heavily on my mind." "Perhaps," Amelia hesitated, "perhaps we might still be blessed with a child." George gave her a sad smile. Years of trying had yielded nothing but disappointment. Whatever illness plagued him seemed to have robbed him of more than just his strength. Privately, he wondered if Eleanor's exile had somehow cursed him. A fanciful thought for a king, but one that haunted him in the dark hours. "Your Majesty should rest," Amelia suggested, ringing for a servant. "I've had the royal physician prepare a new tonic." George nodded absently, unaware that this newest tonic, like all the medicines arranged by Edward, contained the slow poison steadily destroying his body. Miles away in Silver Bay, the morning sun streamed through open windows as 3 identical 7-year-old girls sat at a wooden table, copper braids catching the light like flames. Though mirror images in appearance, their personalities had developed as distinctly as separate flowers from the same root. "Madison, stop taking my slate," Taylor protested, reaching across the table. Madison, the firstborn, merely smirked. "I'm improving your map. Look, you've put the mountain range in the wrong place." "Girls," Eleanor, known to the village as Mary the Healer, admonished gently, "we share in this house." Penelope, the quietest of the 3, glanced up from her own drawing with a distant expression. "Someone's coming," she announced. "Someone sick. Very sick." Eleanor had long since stopped questioning Penelope's premonitions. Within minutes, urgent knocking confirmed her daughter's prediction. A fisherman stood at the door, supporting his feverish son. "Mary, please," the man begged. "The boy's been burning up since dawn." Eleanor ushered them inside, her practiced hands already examining the child. The poison that had nearly killed her during pregnancy had left lasting effects, occasional weakness and chronic pain, but had also deepened her understanding of healing. What had been talent before was now something approaching mastery. "Madison, fetch the willow bark tea," she instructed. "Taylor, cool water and cloths. Penelope, my blue jar." The girls moved with practiced efficiency, each naturally gravitating to their strengths. Madison took charge, giving precise measurements for the tea. Taylor spoke soothingly to the frightened child, her natural empathy calming him instantly. Penelope simply placed her hand over the boy's forehead and closed her eyes briefly before selecting additional herbs. Eleanor hadn't requested, yet proved to be exactly what was needed. By midday, the boy's fever had broken, as the grateful father carried his sleeping son home. Hannah, now showing strands of silver in her dark hair, watched from the garden. "The villagers talk, you know," she said quietly when Eleanor joined her. "They say your daughters have magic in their blood." Eleanor sighed. "I've tried to teach them discretion." "It's not just their talents," Hannah replied. "It's those eyes. The royal blue is unmistakable to anyone who's ever seen the king." Eleanor gazed toward the ocean, where her 3 daughters now played along the shore. Silver Bay is isolated enough that few here would recognize the Stanton blue eyes. Besides, who would believe that the king's heirs are 3 identical girls born to an exiled queen? Hannah's expression remained troubled. The Duke's agents still search. "Last month in Westport, they questioned Martha about new arrivals from 7 years ago. Edward won't rest until he's certain I'm dead," Eleanor agreed grimly. "Or until George is dead and the crown is his." The truth of this statement hung heavy between them, despite the peaceful life they'd built in Silver Bay. Eleanor's respected position as the village healer. The girls' happy childhood. The shadow of Virginia's palace politics never fully receded. That evening, as Eleanor tucked her daughters into the bed they still insisted on sharing, Madison asked the question Eleanor had been dreading for years. "Mother, why don't we have a father when everyone else does?" Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "Your father is an important man. Circumstances forced us apart before you were born." "Is he dead?" Taylor asked, always the most emotional of the 3. "No, sweetheart, he's alive." Penelope, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. "He's sick, like the fever boy today. But worse. Much worse." A chill ran through Eleanor. She'd learned to trust Penelope's visions. "What else do you see, little one?" Penelope's sapphire eyes, so like George's, seemed to focus on something distant. "He sits on a chair that shines. People bow to him, but behind his back they whisper. A gray man puts something in his cup when no one's looking." She blinked. Returning to the present, "Is our father a king, Mother?" The directness of the question startled Eleanor. She looked at the 3 identical faces watching her expectantly and made a decision. Though they were young, they deserved some measure of truth. "Yes," she admitted softly. "Your father is King George II of Virginia." Madison's eyes widened. "Then we're princesses," Taylor finished, wonder in her voice. "Secret princesses," Eleanor corrected firmly. "And it must remain secret. There are people at court who would harm you if they knew you existed." "The gray man," Penelope said with certainty. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, most likely. Now sleep." "My darlings, we'll speak more of this tomorrow." After the girls had fallen asleep, Eleanor stood at the cottage window, looking toward the capital far beyond the horizon. If Penelope's vision was accurate, George's condition was worsening. How long before Edward's schemes reached fruition? And what would become of her daughters, the rightful heirs to Virginia's throne, when that day came? In the palace and the cottage, 2 worlds continued their separate orbits, unaware that the paths of a poisoned king and his hidden daughters were slowly, inexorably converging toward a destiny none could fully foresee. Darkness fell early across Virginia's capital as an unseasonable cold front swept in from the north. In the royal bedchamber, physicians huddled around Queen Amelia's bed, their faces grave. The mysterious illness that had first appeared in the coastal villages had finally breached the palace walls, and the queen had fallen victim to its ruthless progression. "Her fever continues to rise, Your Majesty," the royal physician reported. Bowing to King George, "We've tried every conventional treatment without success." George stared down at his wife's flushed face. Though theirs had never been a love match, he had grown fond of Amelia over their years together. She had been a dutiful queen, if somewhat cold and ambitious. "There must be something more we can do," he insisted, his voice hoarse from the same persistent cough that had plagued him for years. Duke Edward Thompson stood in the shadows, his expression carefully neutral. The epidemic had not figured into his plans. While the Queen's death wouldn't hinder his ambitions, the widespread panic might complicate his carefully orchestrated takeover. "Your Majesty," Lord Fairfax ventured, "there are reports of a healer in a coastal village called Silver Bay. They say she saved their entire community when the same fever struck there last spring." George's head lifted. "Silver Bay? I'm unfamiliar with the place. A small fishing village, sire. Isolated, barely worthy of notice on most maps," Edward interjected quickly. "And surely we cannot trust the Queen's life to some village witch." If our own physicians can offer no remedy, what choice do we have? George countered, new energy in his voice. Send for this healer immediately. The roads are dangerous. Your Majesty, Edward protested. The fever has caused panic, and there are reports of brigands. Then send a full-armed escort, George snapped, his royal authority flaring through his illness. I want this healer brought to the palace without delay. As the council members dispersed to carry out his orders, George noticed the tight set of Edward's jaw. It was the same expression his cousin wore when losing at chess, a game George had once excelled at, before his illness dulled his strategic mind. You disapprove, cousin? George asked quietly. Edward masked his frustration with practiced concern. I worry only for your well-being. Sire, these rural healers often employ questionable methods. Yet you've allowed me to consume every tonic and remedy our royal physicians have concocted, George observed. Strange that you should suddenly develop such scruples. Something in the king's tone, a hint of suspicion long dormant, made Edward straighten. Had George begun to suspect? Impossible. The poison had been administered too carefully, the symptoms attributed to natural decline. I seek only to protect the crown, as always, Edward replied smoothly. Indeed, George murmured, as always. In Silver Bay, Penelope woke screaming from a nightmare, startling her sisters and mother from sleep. The king calls, she gasped, her 7-year-old face ashen in the moonlight. The past returns. The truth will be revealed. Eleanor lit a candle with trembling hands. What did you see, little one? Men on horses, coming here, palace guards with the royal crest. Penelope's eyes remained unfocused. They seek the healer of Silver Bay. The queen is dying. Madison sat up straighter. Queen, you mean, not our mother, Penelope clarified. The other one, father's new wife. Eleanor exchanged an alarmed glance with Hannah, who had rushed in from her adjoining room. This was no ordinary dream. Penelope's visions had proven uncannily accurate over the years. When will they arrive? Eleanor asked. Tomorrow, before sunset. Penelope's breathing slowed as the vision receded. Mother, you must go with them. Absolutely not, Hannah protested. It's too dangerous, the Duke will not recognize me, Eleanor finished. 7 years and much hardship have changed my appearance. She moved to the small looking glass on the wall, studying her reflection in the candlelight. The elegant queen was long gone. In her place stood a woman weathered by loss and survival. Her once vibrant copper hair now contained streaks of silver, and her face bore the subtle lines of a woman who had suffered and healed in equal measure. The risk is still too great, Hannah insisted. And what of the risk if I refuse? Eleanor countered. If the queen dies because I stayed hidden, what then? The capital will be vulnerable. Panic will spread. And eventually, investigators might trace the origins of the fever's cure to Silver Bay. She looked at her daughters. To us, Madison, always the strategist, nodded slowly. Mother's right. Better to control the encounter than wait for discovery. Taylor's eyes filled with tears. But what if the Duke is there? What if he recognizes you? Then I shall finally have the proof I've spent 7 years gathering, Eleanor said grimly. The scroll I took from the palace library describes not only the poison used against me, but also its unique scent, detectable only to those who have carried it in their blood, if the same poison is being used on George. I'll know. By morning, the village buzzed with news of royal messengers approaching. Eleanor prepared a travel kit of essential medicines, her mind racing through contingencies. She had known this day might come, had planned for it in abstract terms, but the reality hit with unexpected force. You must take great care, she instructed her daughters. Stay with Hannah and Martha. No wandering, no speaking of your father or the palace. The girls nodded solemnly, the weight of their heritage never more apparent than in this moment, just before sunset. As Penelope had predicted, a royal contingent arrived in Silver Bay. Their leader, Captain James Bennet of the Royal Guard, appeared startled when the villagers immediately directed him to Mary the Healer's cottage. How did you know we were coming? He asked, suspicion evident in his tone. News travels, even to remote villages, Eleanor replied smoothly. I assume you seek aid for victims of the fever. Captain Bennet studied her face carefully. The Queen herself lies ill. King George VI requires your presence at the palace immediately. Eleanor allowed appropriate hesitation before nodding. I will need to bring my medicines and travel under conditions that allow me to work. We have a covered wagon prepared, the captain said, and orders to accommodate any reasonable requests. However, he added, lowering his voice, I must also relay certain security precautions. The precautions became clear as they prepared to depart. Eleanor was permitted to bring her medical supplies, but would travel blindfolded for much of the journey to the capital, ostensibly to protect palace routes, but more likely to prevent her from escaping or communicating with accomplices. As the guards helped her into the wagon, Eleanor caught a final glimpse of her daughters watching from the cottage window. Penelope's expression was eerily calm, as if she could see beyond this moment to some conclusion only she could envision. Madison stood protectively beside her sisters, calculating eyes already planning for their mother's absence. Taylor wiped tears silently, her sensitive nature most affected by the separation. I will return, Eleanor called to them, allowing herself this one small breach of her guarded persona. As the wagon pulled away, Hannah stepped forward to stand behind the girls, one hand on each of the older twins' shoulders. Penelope, however, slipped from her grasp and ran to the village edge, calling out words that only Eleanor could hear above the wagon's rumble. The 3 crowns await your signal, mother. Eleanor closed her eyes against sudden tears. After 7 years of hiding, she was returning to the world that had betrayed her, to the palace where she had known both greatest love and deepest betrayal, to the husband who had condemned her without a fair hearing, and to the enemy who had poisoned them both. Yet in this dangerous game, she now held 3 extraordinary cards unknown to her opponents. 3 small princesses with royal blue eyes and crown-shaped birthmarks. Waiting for their moment to reshape the kingdom's destiny, the journey to the royal palace took 2 days. Eleanor spent much of it blindfolded as promised, though she hardly needed her eyes to recognize the familiar sense of Virginia's changing landscapes, the salt marsh giving way to pine forests, then the apple orchards that signaled proximity to the capital. Her body remembered each transition, a map written in senses no blindfold could block. When they finally removed the cloth from her eyes, the palace loomed before her, both achingly familiar and strangely foreign. 7 years had added a new eastern wing, and the gardens she once tended had been redesigned in a more formal French style, Amelia's influence, no doubt. The healer has arrived, Your Grace, Captain Bennet announced as they entered the palace's medical wing. Duke Edward Thompson turned, his face betraying no recognition as he studied the travel-worn woman before him. Eleanor kept her eyes downcast, her posture humble, the demeanor of a simple village healer awed by royal surroundings. You understand the gravity of your task, Edward asked coldly. The Queen's life hangs in the balance. I will do everything in my power, Eleanor murmured, her voice deliberately roughened and her accent subtly altered. See that you do. Success will be generously rewarded. Failure. He left the threat unspoken. Eleanor was escorted to Queen Amelia's chambers, where royal physicians hovered uselessly around the bed. The Queen lay motionless, her renowned beauty ravaged by fever, as the doctors reluctantly made space for the village healer. Eleanor caught the distinctive scent she'd been dreading, not from Amelia, but from the medicines arranged at her bedside. Who prepares the Queen's tonics? She asked, careful to keep her tone deferential. His Grace the Duke personally oversees Her Majesty's care, replied the head physician stiffly. Eleanor nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The same poison that had nearly killed her now coursed through Amelia's veins, likely administered in smaller doses until the fever provided perfect cover for increasing the amount to lethal levels. Working methodically, Eleanor began unpacking her remedies. I'll need fresh water, boiled and cooled, and privacy to work, the physicians protested, but a lady-in-waiting intervened. The king instructed us to give the healer whatever she requires. Alone with the unconscious queen, Eleanor worked swiftly. She administered the herbal compound that had saved Silver Bay from the fever, then added a second tincture, the antidote to Edward's poison she had spent years perfecting. As she worked, she searched the room for clues to the palace's current dynamics. How advanced were Edward's plans? How much did Amelia know? A small portrait on the bedside table caught her attention. George, looking far older than his 54 years. With Amelia beside him, the artist had captured the king's decline with painful accuracy. The stooped posture, the hollow cheeks, the dimmed sapphire eyes that once flashed with intelligence and vigor. "What has he done to you?" Eleanor whispered, her practiced detachment cracking. The door opened suddenly, and Eleanor turned to find herself face to face with the king himself. The shock of seeing him nearly stole her breath. The portrait had not exaggerated his decline. If anything, it had been kind. George's eyes widened slightly as he looked at her. A flicker of something. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. Crossing his face, Eleanor dropped into a deep curtsy, using the motion to compose herself. "Your Majesty," she murmured, eyes downcast. "I've administered the first treatments for the Queen's fever." George seemed unable to speak for a moment, still staring at her face. "You seem familiar," he finally said. "I doubt our paths have crossed, Your Majesty. I've spent my life in Silver Bay." "Silver Bay," he repeated slowly. "The name itself is new to me. A fishing village, they said." "Yes, sire, small but resilient." The king moved closer to his wife's bedside, but his eyes kept returning to Eleanor's face. "They say you saved your entire village when this fever struck." "Not I alone, Your Majesty. I had help." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Eleanor could see the confusion in George's expression, the sense of recognition battling against reason. 7 years had changed her, but not enough to completely disguise the woman he had once loved. "Your Majesty should rest," she suggested gently. "The Queen will need time to respond to the treatment." George nodded distractedly, then paused at the door. "Healer, what shall I call you?" "Mary, Your Majesty. Just Mary?" "Mary," he repeated, still staring at her with that bewildered expression. "You will stay until the Queen recovers." "As long as I'm needed, sire." After George departed, Eleanor released a shaky breath. The encounter had been both worse and better than she'd feared. He suspected something, but couldn't quite place her. More concerning was his physical condition. The tremor in his hands, the labored breathing, the yellowish tint to his skin, all pointed to years of systematic poisoning. For the next 3 days, Eleanor divided her time between treating the Queen and secretly gathering evidence of Edward's crimes. She discovered the same poison in the king's daily tonics, though administered more gradually than to Amelia. She noted which servants were loyal to Edward, which medicines came directly from his private stores, which physicians seemed complicit or merely oblivious. Most importantly, she avoided being alone with George, whose confused recognition seemed to strengthen with each passing day. She couldn't risk full discovery. Not yet. Not until she had concrete proof of Edward's treachery. On the morning of the 4th day, Eleanor was checking on Amelia when the Queen's eyes suddenly opened, clear and alert for the first time. "I know who you are," Amelia whispered, her voice faint but steady. Eleanor froze. "Your Majesty is confused from the fever." "No." Amelia's grip on Eleanor's wrist was surprisingly strong. "You're her, Eleanor, the first queen." When Eleanor didn't deny it, Amelia continued urgently. "He's killing us both. Edward, I found his book. Records of the poisons, schedules, dosages. He plans to finish George at the recovery banquet." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked cautiously. "Because I was a fool," Amelia admitted, bitter self-recrimination in her voice. "I knew he was ambitious, but I never believed. Until I found my own name in his book, scheduled to die during this fever." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was nothing but a stepping stone for him. We both were. Where is this book now? Hidden in his chambers, behind the portrait of his father. A small red leather volume." Amelia's eyes darted nervously to the door. "He must not know I've awakened yet. It's our only advantage." Eleanor nodded, making a swift decision. "I need to leave the palace. Tonight. Can you continue your pretense of serious illness for 1 more day?" "Yes," Amelia agreed. "But what?" "The less you know, the safer you'll be," Eleanor interrupted. "Just remember, trust no medicine except what I've left in the blue vial." That night, under cover of darkness, Eleanor slipped out of the palace through the servants' quarters. She left behind only a folded note for the king, placed where he alone would find it during his daily morning visit to Amelia's sick room. Seek the truth in Silver Bay, where 3 crowns grow under the same sun. By dawn, she was miles from the capital, riding toward the coast on a horse borrowed from the royal stables. Eleanor knew the risk she was taking, for herself, for Amelia who had become an unexpected ally, and for her daughters who remained vulnerable in Silver Bay. But George deserved to know the truth, to see with his own eyes the living proof of Edward's treachery and his own tragic mistake. As Virginia's forest flashed by, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in 7 years, to hope, not just for justice or survival, but for healing, for the wounds that had festered between her and George, and for the fractured family that might, against all odds, find wholeness again. King George Thickus stared at the cryptic note in his trembling hand. Seek the truth in Silver Bay, where 3 crowns grow under the same sun. The handwriting, elegant despite its obvious haste, stirred memories he had long suppressed. He knew this hand, had once treasured letters written in it. Your Majesty, Dr. Forrester, his personal physician, approached cautiously. The healer has departed without explanation. The Queen, however, shows remarkable improvement. Yes, George murmured absently. Remarkable indeed. The physician hesitated. There's something else, sire. I've been conducting tests on your tonics, as you requested. The results are disturbing. This caught George's full attention. 2 weeks ago, in a moment of clarity, he had secretly ordered Forrester to analyze the medicines prepared under Edward's supervision. The king had long suspected something amiss, but lacked the evidence to confront his cousin. Tell me, he commanded. Poison, Your Majesty. Small amounts. Administered consistently. The pattern suggests it's been happening for years. Forrester's voice dropped lower. And the same compound was found in Queen Amelia's medicines, though in much higher concentrations during her illness. George clenched the note, his mind racing. For years, he'd attributed his decline to age and the burden of rule. Now, pieces were falling into place. Edward's solicitous concern, his insistence on personally overseeing the royal medicines, his gradual consolidation of power as George grew weaker. I need to travel to Silver Bay, he announced abruptly. Immediately and in secret. Sire, in your condition. This is not open for debate, Doctor. George straightened, summoning the authority that had once been second nature. You will accompany me, along with Captain Bennet. No one else must know, especially not the Duke. 4 hours later, the king departed in a simple carriage. Disguised as a wealthy merchant with his physician and guard, the official announcement stated he was resting in his private chambers, not to be disturbed. As they journeyed toward the coast, George's mind returned repeatedly to the mysterious healer, to her familiar eyes, her voice that stirred forgotten emotions, the way she had avoided being alone with him. Could it truly be Eleanor? The thought seemed impossible, yet something in his heart recognized her despite the years and changes. And what of this reference to 3 crowns? The symbolism nagged at him, a riddle just beyond his grasp, in Silver Bay. Eleanor burst into the cottage, startling Hannah and the girls who had been anxiously awaiting news. We must prepare, she announced, her voice taut with urgency. The king may soon arrive. Madison leapt to her feet. Our father is coming here. Eleanor nodded, quickly recounting the events at the palace, Edward's ongoing poisoning scheme, Amelia's unexpected alliance, the evidence still hidden in the palace. I left him a message he couldn't ignore, she finished. If there's anything left of the man I married, he'll come seeking answers. And if the Duke follows, Hannah worried, we'll face that challenge when it comes. Eleanor knelt before her daughters. There's something important we must discuss. The king, your father, doesn't know you exist. The shock will be tremendous. Will he be angry? Taylor asked, her sensitive nature immediately concerned with emotions. Confused, Penelope answered before Eleanor could respond. Then angry, then sad. But in the end, he will understand. Her expression remained serene, as if she'd already witnessed this future. Penelope's right, Eleanor said. Your father has been deceived for many years. The truth will be painful for him. Madison, ever practical, asked, What should we do when he arrives? Be yourselves, Eleanor advised. Nothing more, nothing less. The wait was excruciating. Eleanor paced the small cottage, alternating between preparing for George's arrival and doubting he would come at all. Had her message been too obscure? Had Edward intercepted it? Was George simply too ill to make the journey? 3 days later, Silver Bay held its annual spring festival. Despite the tension of waiting, Eleanor couldn't deny her daughters the celebration they'd anticipated for months. The entire village gathered in the square, adorned with flower garlands and ribbons. Musicians played lively tunes as children danced around the freshly decorated fountain. Madison, Taylor, and Penelope joined hands with the other children, their identical copper braids flying as they spun in the traditional circle dance. Unconsciously, they had each worn their simplest dresses that day, dresses that left visible their crown-shaped birthmarks, Madison's shoulder, Taylor's wrist, and the edge of Penelope's mark peeking above her collar. 3 royal crowns displayed unknowingly for all to see. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with love and fear in equal measure. They were so beautiful, so innocent of the political storm surrounding their existence. A sudden hush fell over one section of the crowd. Eleanor turned to see 3 strangers at the edge of the square, an older gentleman leaning heavily on a walking stick, flanked by 2 younger men who scanned the crowd with watchful eyes. George, despite his merchant's disguise and the ravages of illness, Eleanor would have known him anywhere. Their eyes met across the square, and for one breathless moment, the years between them seemed to vanish. Then his gaze moved past her, drawn inexorably to the fountain where 3 identical girls danced in perfect synchrony. Eleanor saw the exact moment comprehension struck him, his body stiffening, his free hand clutching at his chest as if physically struck. The music continued, but George stood transfixed, watching the triplets with undisguised shock. When the dance brought them spinning closer, the sunlight caught their eyes. Unmistakable royal blue, the precise shade that had marked Stanton monarchs for generations. Dr. Forrester steadied the king as he swayed slightly. "Your Majesty, do you see them?" George whispered hoarsely. "Do you see their eyes?" "I do, sire," the physician replied, his own face registering astonishment. "And something else as well." As the dance concluded, the girls curtsied to each other, and George caught clear glimpses of the crown-shaped birthmarks. His walking stick clattered to the ground. Eleanor moved toward him then, her heart pounding. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now found herself speechless. Before the reality of it, the girls noticed her movement and turned, spotting the strangers, with uncanny perception. All 3 froze, their expressions showing different aspects of the same recognition. They somehow knew, without being told, exactly who stood before them. "Father," Penelope said simply, the word carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. George looked from the child to Eleanor, decades of betrayal and suffering crystallizing into one agonizing question. How? Eleanor gestured toward her cottage. "Not here," she said quietly. "Please." What followed was the most difficult conversation of Eleanor's life, within the cottage's humble walls. She revealed everything: the Duke's poisoning scheme, her discovery of pregnancy after exile, the miraculous birth against impossible odds. "I discovered I was with child the night I was banished," she explained, while the girls waited outside with Hannah. "The poison Edward used was meant to prevent conception. But somehow, 3 children," George murmured, still struggling to absorb the reality. 3 daughters. In 500 years, no Stanton monarch has had multiple heirs. Dr. Forrester, who had been quietly examining the medical evidence Eleanor presented, looked up sharply. This oriental poison, could it have affected the royal bloodline somehow? Perhaps causing the multiple birth? "I've wondered that myself," Eleanor admitted. The ancient scroll suggested it might alter a woman's fertility in unpredictable ways. George paced the small room, agitation overcoming weakness. "You've raised them here all this time while his voice broke. While I believed you guilty of treason. I had no way to prove my innocence," Eleanor replied softly. "And later, when the girls were born, I feared what Edward might do if he discovered them." The king stopped before the window, watching his daughters in the garden. "May I meet them properly, not as a stranger, but as—" He couldn't finish. "Of course," Eleanor said. "They've known about you their entire lives." The meeting that followed was tentative, awkward, yet somehow profound. George sat stiffly as the three girls studied him with identical blue eyes. Then, without warning, Taylor, the most emotional of the three, threw her arms around his neck. "We've been waiting for you," she whispered. Something broke within the king. Then, he gathered his daughter close, tears streaming down his face. Madison approached next, touching his cheek with analytical curiosity, as if confirming he was real. Penelope simply placed her small hand in his larger one, her expression suggesting she'd always known this moment would come. "They have gifts," Eleanor explained, watching the scene with her own eyes brimming. Madison's strategic mind, Taylor's empathy, Penelope's visions, each unique yet complementary. As the initial shock subsided, George's expression hardened with new resolve. "Edward will pay for what he's done, to you, to our daughters, to Virginia itself. First, we need proof others will believe," Eleanor cautioned. "My word against his would not be enough, even with your support." Amelia mentioned a book, George recalled, hidden in Edward's chambers. "Yes, but retrieving it will be dangerous. And there's another concern." Eleanor was interrupted by Dr. Forrester, who had been examining the king throughout their conversation. "Your Majesty cannot delay treatment any longer," he stated firmly. "The poison has done extensive damage." Before George could protest, the cottage door burst open. Captain Bennet rushed in, his expression grim. "Urgent news from the capital, sire," he reported. "Queen Amelia has revealed your absence to the Duke. Edward has declared you mentally unfit to rule due to delusions, and is preparing to be crowned regent in 3 days' time. All roads to the capital will be blocked by now," Captain Bennet reported grimly. "The Duke has likely claimed you're being held against your will, using it as pretext for the regency." George's jaw tightened with determination that belied his weakened state. "We must return immediately. Every moment strengthens Edward's position." "But how?" Eleanor asked. "Even if we could pass his roadblocks." "You need treatment for the poison." She turned to Dr. Forrester. "How much time does he have?" The physician's expression was grave. "Without proper treatment, weeks at most. With the antidote you've developed." He paused, calculating. "Perhaps months, possibly years if we can eliminate all traces from his system." "I'll take those odds," George declared. "Virginia needs its king now." Hannah, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. There might be a way to reach the capital undetected. When all eyes turned to her, she explained. "During the colonial wars, Silver Bay served as an emergency supply route when main roads were compromised. There's an old tunnel system beneath the monastery ruins on the northern cliff." "Tunnels," Madison echoed, her strategic mind immediately intrigued. "How far do they extend?" "Legend says they reach nearly to the capital," Hannah replied, "though no one has traversed their full length in generations." Penelope stepped forward, her young face unusually solemn. "They go to the old cathedral crypts beneath the palace," she stated with quiet certainty. When the adults stared at her in astonishment, she added simply, "I've seen it in my dreams." Eleanor had learned never to dismiss her youngest daughter's visions. "Is the path clear?" "Safe." Penelope closed her eyes briefly. "Mostly there are obstacles, collapsed sections, but there's a way through." "Then that's our route," George decided. "Captain, what forces can we trust absolutely?" "Very few, Your Majesty. The Royal Guard is divided. Some loyal to you, others bought by the Duke's promises. Lord Admiral Hastings remains steadfastly yours, but his fleet is stationed at Hampton Harbor. Send word to Hastings," George ordered. "He's to position ships along the coast as if preparing for routine maneuvers, but be ready to support us if needed." Night fell over Silver Bay, and frantic preparations began. Eleanor worked tirelessly, preparing medicines for George's journey while instructing Hannah on treatments to continue in her absence. "You can't possibly mean to bring the children," Hannah protested when Eleanor began packing clothes for the triplets. "I can't leave them here unprotected," Eleanor replied. "If Edward learns of their existence and can't find me, he'll tear apart every coastal village looking for them. But the tunnels, the danger, we'll be safer together," Eleanor insisted, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her certainty. Madison overheard this exchange and gathered her sisters in their shared bedroom. "We need to be ready," she told them, her young face set with determination far beyond her 7 years. "I'm scared," Taylor admitted, clutching her favorite doll. "Me too," Madison acknowledged. "But Mother and Father need us to be brave." Penelope sat cross-legged on the bed, eyes distant. "We'll need the lantern with the blue glass," she murmured. "And Father must drink Mother's medicine exactly when the pocket watch shows midnight." Before dawn, a small procession made its way up the cliff path to the monastery ruins, George leaning heavily on Captain Bennett, Eleanor carrying essential medicines, Dr. Forrester burdened with medical supplies, and the 3 girls following closely, each carrying a small pack with necessities. "The entrance should be behind the old abbot's quarters," Hannah directed, leading them through crumbling stone archways. Decades of coastal storms had reduced the once grand monastery to skeletal remains, with only the hardiest walls still standing against the relentless Atlantic winds. After moving aside several large stones, they uncovered a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The sea air gave way to musty dampness as they ventured downward, their path illuminated only by lanterns. "These tunnels were built for supply carts," Hannah explained. "They should be wide enough for comfortable passage." The initial stretch proved her right. A broad, stone-lined passage sloping gently inland, but after an hour's journey, they encountered the first major obstacle, a collapsed section blocking the tunnel entirely. "Now what?" Dr. Forrester asked, his urban sensibilities clearly uncomfortable with their subterranean route. Penelope stepped forward confidently. "This way," she said, pointing to a narrow side passage almost hidden behind a fallen column. "It reconnects to the main tunnel beyond the collapse." George watched his youngest daughter with fascination. Has she always had this gift of sight? "Since birth," Eleanor confirmed. "Each of them has special talents. Madison's strategic thinking has already saved the village from spring floods, and Taylor's empathy can calm the most distressed patients with just a few words." "Remarkable," George murmured, a mixture of pride and regret coloring his voice. 7 years lost." Eleanor's expression softened. "Not lost. Different than we expected, but they've grown into extraordinary children." Their journey continued through increasingly challenging terrain. Twice more, Penelope guided them around obstacles with unerring accuracy. At midday, they paused for rest and a simple meal in a chamber where several tunnels converged. George took this opportunity to really speak with his daughters for the first time. Initially awkward, he gradually found himself drawn into their world. Madison's incisive questions about royal strategy, Taylor's earnest desire to know about palace gardens, Penelope's quiet observations that occasionally startled him with their insight. "You know," he told Eleanor as they prepared to continue, "they have your intelligence but my mother's forthright manner. And your eyes," she reminded him softly. "The royal bloodline runs strong in them." By evening, George's strength was flagging despite Eleanor's medicines. Dr. Forrester insisted on a longer rest, and they made camp in a relatively dry chamber with a small freshwater spring, another of Penelope's discoveries. While the others slept, Eleanor kept watch with Captain Bennett, their lantern turned low to conserve oil. "You never believed the accusations against me, did you?" she asked quietly. Bennett's weathered face showed momentary surprise before he answered. "I had my doubts, Your Majesty. The evidence seemed convenient, but it wasn't my place to question. Yet you're risking everything now, because I've seen the truth with my own eyes," he replied simply, glancing toward the sleeping girls. "Those children are Stantons, beyond any doubt. The royal blue eyes never lie." Their conversation was interrupted by a distant rumbling that sent small stones skittering across the floor. "What was that?" Eleanor whispered, instantly alert. "Nothing good," Bennett replied, reaching for his sword. The noise came again, closer now, a rhythmic pounding that echoed through the tunnels. Madison woke immediately, her tactical mind assessing the situation. "Someone's breaking through from above," she concluded. George struggled to his feet. "Edward must have discovered the tunnels. We need to move. Now." They hastily gathered their belongings. Rousing the others, Penelope, unusually agitated, tugged at Eleanor's sleeve. "Not that way," she insisted when Bennett suggested continuing along their current path. "They're coming from ahead too. We need to take the flooded passage." "Flooded?" Dr. Forrester echoed in alarm. "Surely there's another route." Penelope shook her head firmly. It's the only safe path now. Trusting her daughter's vision, Eleanor nodded. Lead the way. Penelope guided them to a narrow side tunnel where ankle-deep water reflected their lantern light. As they waded deeper, the water rose steadily to their knees, then waists. The children can't swim through if it gets deeper, Bennett warned. George, despite his weakness, lifted Penelope onto his shoulders. I can carry one, Captain Dr. Forrester. Take the others. The water eventually reached the adults' chests, but thankfully rose no further. After nearly an hour of difficult wading, they emerged into a larger, drier chamber with a promising sight, carved stone steps leading upward. The cathedral crypts, Penelope announced, her voice echoing slightly. We're beneath the palace now. Bennett ascended first to ensure the way was clear, then signaled the others to follow. They emerged behind an ornate tomb in the royal crypt. The space dimly lit by eternal flames kept burning for past monarchs. We made it, Eleanor breathed, helping George up the final steps. His condition had deteriorated during their underground journey, his breathing labored and skin clammy. Just in time, Dr. Forrester observed, checking the king's pulse. He needs rest and treatment immediately. The royal chapel connects directly to the palace through a private passage, George explained between ragged breaths. From there, we can reach my chambers undetected. As they prepared to leave the crypt, a soft voice spoke from the shadows. I've been waiting for you. Everyone tensed, weapons half drawn, before Queen Amelia stepped into the light, her expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. Thank God you've come, she said. The coronation ceremony is tomorrow at noon. Edward has convinced half the court you've gone mad and fled the capital. Her eyes widened as she noticed the 3 identical girls. These are my daughters, George confirmed, a hint of pride breaking through his exhaustion. The rightful heirs to Virginia's throne. Amelia nodded slowly, absorbing this revelation. Then we have even more reason to act quickly. Edward's men patrol the main corridors, but I can guide you through the servants' passages. She held out a small red leather book. And I have what you need. Edward's poison journal, with every detail of his crimes recorded in his own hand. Dawn broke over the capital with unusual splendor, as if nature itself celebrated the day. In the palace's east wing, Duke Edward Thompson stood before a full-length mirror as servants made final adjustments to his regency robes. Deep burgundy velvet trimmed with ermine, custom-made for this very occasion. Perfect timing, he murmured to his reflection. The people love a coronation in spring. Lord Fairfax entered with a deferential bow. The cathedral is prepared, Your Grace. Foreign dignitaries have been seated according to protocol, and our royal patient, still secluded in his chambers as you ordered. The official story that he's too mentally fragile to attend has been accepted without question. Edward smiled thinly. Excellent. And the Queen? Recovering but weak. Her physicians report she's unlikely to leave her bed for several days. How fortunate, Edward remarked, adjusting his ceremonial sword. Everything proceeds exactly as planned. What Edward didn't know was that George's royal apartments now house not only the king but also Eleanor, Dr. Forrester, Captain Bennett, and 3 young princesses whose existence threatened everything the Duke had worked for. Throughout the night, Eleanor had administered intensive treatments to counteract the poison in George's system. By morning, he showed marked improvement, still weak, but clear-eyed and focused. We have the evidence, George said, studying Edward's poison journal with mounting rage. Now we need a strategy. Madison, who had been listening intently, spoke up. We should wait until he's before everyone at the ceremony. Public exposure is our strongest weapon. Even in crisis, George couldn't help but marvel at his daughter's tactical mind. You're right. Edward has spent years building his facade of loyalty. We must shatter it before the entire court and visiting dignitaries. Queen Amelia, who had joined them at first light, nodded in agreement. The ceremony begins at noon. The Duke's actual coronation as regent is scheduled for precisely 12:30. After the traditional prayers and proclamations, then we make our entrance at 12:25, Captain Bennett suggested. Maximum impact, minimum time for his supporters to organize resistance. As the others discussed logistics, Eleanor pulled Dr. Forrester aside. Will he have the strength for this? Physically, perhaps with your medicines, the physician answered honestly. But the emotional toll of confronting his cousin, while simultaneously revealing the existence of the princesses, he left the thought unfinished. Eleanor understood. For 7 years, George had believed her a would-be assassin. Now he faced not only the truth of Edward's betrayal, but also the staggering reality of triplet heirs he'd never known existed. Any man might buckle under such revelations, let alone one weakened by years of poisoning. "We have no choice," she said softly. "Virginia needs its true king today." Noon approached with excruciating slowness. From their hiding place, they could hear the cathedral bells begin their ceremonial tolling. Royal guards, those few Bennet had confirmed as trustworthy, were positioned strategically throughout the palace. Queen Amelia had returned to her chambers to maintain the pretense of illness, while creating a diversion if needed. At 12:15, they began their movement through secret passages toward the cathedral. George wore his most formal royal attire, leaning slightly on a scepter that doubled as a walking stick. Eleanor, dressed in a simple but elegant gown borrowed from Amelia, walked beside him. Captain Bennet led the way, while the 3 princesses, freshly bathed and dressed in hastily altered royal children's garments, followed with Dr. Forrester. They reached the cathedral's side entrance as Archbishop Collins intoned. And so, in recognition of His Majesty's unfortunate incapacity, and in accordance with royal precedent, we prepare to invest His Grace, Duke Edward Thompson, with the powers of Regent of Virginia. "Now," George whispered. The great doors swung open. Captain Bennet strode forward first, announcing in a voice that rang through the vaulted space, "His Majesty, King George this of Virginia." A collective gasp rose from the assembled nobility as George entered, walking slowly but regally down the center aisle. Eleanor followed 2 paces behind, her head held high despite the whispers that erupted at her appearance. Then came the true shock. 3 identical young girls, their copper hair and royal blue eyes unmistakable to anyone familiar with Stanton genetics. At the altar, Edward froze mid-bow, his face draining of color. "This is impossible," he stammered, regaining composure with visible effort. "Your Majesty, we feared for your safety, and you've brought guests." George continued his deliberate progress until he stood directly before his cousin. "Not guests, Edward, family." His voice, though quieter than in his prime, carried throughout the cathedral. "My wife, Queen Eleanor, falsely accused and unjustly exiled, and my daughters, the Princesses Madison, Taylor, and Penelope." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Edward's eyes darted frantically between George and the children, calculation and panic warring on his face. "Your Majesty is unwell," he said loudly. "These delusions of a former queen and impossible heirs only confirm what your physicians have reported, please. Allow me to escort you back to your chambers." "I think not," George replied, producing the red leather journal. "This record, in your own hand, details years of poisoning. First my wife to prevent conception, then me to hasten my decline, your ultimate aim, the throne itself." The Archbishop stepped back in shock. Edward's supporters shifted uncomfortably. Several noble families who had maintained neutrality in the succession debate now moved subtly away from the Duke. Edward's facade cracked. Lies, forgeries. He turned to the assembled court. "Can't you see? He's been bewitched by that herb witch. She was exiled for attempted regicide, and now returns with these changelings, claiming royal blood. The royal blue eyes cannot be falsified," Lord Hastings called out from among the naval officers. "Nor can crown birthmarks be manufactured." At George's nod, the girls stepped forward and displayed their marks. Madison pushing her sleeve aside, Taylor extending her wrist, Penelope touching the spot above her heart. Another wave of gasps swept the cathedral. Edward, seeing his carefully constructed plans crumbling, made a desperate move. With shocking speed for a man his age, he lunged forward, seizing Madison before anyone could react. "Stand back!" he shouted, drawing a concealed dagger. "Or the princess dies first!" Chaos erupted. Guards drew swords. Nobles scrambled for exits. Edward, dragging a struggling Madison, backed toward a side door leading to the bell tower staircase. "Lower your weapons," he demanded, "or I'll send Her Highness to meet her ancestors." George started forward but staggered. the exertion of the confrontation taxing his fragile recovery. Eleanor caught his arm, her eyes fixed on their daughter. Madison remained remarkably composed, her analytical mind clearly working despite her predicament. She caught Taylor's eye with a subtle nod, then Penelope's. As Edward reached the door, Taylor suddenly called out in a voice of surprising authority for a 7-year-old. "Uncle Edward, you don't really want to hurt me, do you?" The deliberate confusion, Taylor speaking as if she were Madison, made Edward hesitate just slightly. "Silence, child. But we're your blood too," Taylor continued, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "Your own great nieces. Would you really harm your family?" Edward's grip loosened fractionally. "Stay back." While Taylor held his attention with her remarkable empathic appeal, Penelope tugged Eleanor's sleeve, whispering urgently. Understanding bloomed in Eleanor's eyes, and she swiftly removed a small vial from her medicine pouch. "The paralysis extract," she murmured to George. "From the Eastern lily." George nodded grimly, memories of Eleanor's herbal knowledge rushing back. "Can you get close enough?" "I must," she replied simply, as Edward backed through the doorway, still holding Madison. Eleanor slipped into the shadows along the wall, moving parallel to his retreat. The Duke was so focused on the confrontation before him that he failed to notice her circuitous approach. Captain Bennet, comprehending their strategy, created a diversion by ordering his guards to lower their weapons. "Release the princess, your grace. The king is willing to negotiate." "Negotiate," Edward sneered. "I'm beyond negotiations. The girl comes with me until my ship clears the harbor," just as he turned to ascend the stairs. Eleanor emerged from the shadows behind him, the uncorked vial in her hand. With the skill of a practiced healer, she flung the extract directly at his face. Edward howled as the liquid splashed his skin, his free arm rising instinctively to wipe his eyes. In that crucial moment, Madison twisted free and darted down the stairs. Edward, partially blinded and feeling the first effects of the paralytic, stumbled forward, directly into the waiting arms of George and Captain Bennet. "Edward Thompson," George pronounced, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "You are arrested for high treason, attempted regicide, and crimes against the Crown of Virginia." As guards secured the struggling Duke, George turned to the assembled court, one arm around Madison and the other extended to Taylor and Penelope, who rushed to join them. Eleanor completed the circle, her eyes meeting George's over their daughters' heads. "Behold," George announced, his voice gaining strength with each word, "the true future of Virginia." In the days that followed, Virginia witnessed justice unfold with breathtaking swiftness. Duke Edward Thompson, confronted with his own meticulous records of poisoning, confessed to his crimes before the Royal Council. The red leather journal revealed not only his systematic poisoning of both king and queens, but also a network of bribed officials and servants who had enabled his schemes. "I recognized Eleanor's potential fertility despite my toxins," Edward admitted bitterly during his formal hearing. "That's why I pushed for her exile rather than execution. I never imagined she was already with child, let alone 3. The council sentenced him to lifelong imprisonment in Black Rock Fortress, Virginia's most remote prison on the northern border. As for his accomplices, most received lesser punishments according to their level of involvement. Queen Amelia, in recognition of her eventual cooperation, was permitted to retire to the Sacred Heart Convent, where she would spend her remaining years in quiet contemplation. Within the palace, a remarkable healing process began for both the kingdom and the royal family. Dr. Forrester, working closely with Eleanor, developed a comprehensive treatment regimen that gradually purged the poison from George's system, though some damage proved permanent. A slight tremor in his left hand, occasional weakness in cold weather. The king regained much of his former vigor. More challenging was the emotional recovery for George and Eleanor. 7 years of separation and betrayal had left deep scars. They moved cautiously around each other, relearning rhythms once taken for granted, discovering the people they'd become during their time apart. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," George confessed one evening as they walked in the royal gardens Eleanor had once tended. "I condemned you without a proper investigation, without even allowing you to truly defend yourself. You were being poisoned, manipulated," Eleanor reminded him gently. "Edward spent years constructing his deception. Still, I should have trusted what I knew of your character." George stopped beside a bench where they had often sat together in those early, happy years. I failed you as a husband, and I failed you by running, rather than finding a way to prove my innocence, Eleanor replied. Perhaps we both have regrets enough for a lifetime. George took her hand tentatively. Can we build something new from these broken pieces? Eleanor's smile held both sadness and hope. I believe we already have. She nodded toward the palace terrace, where their 3 daughters were engaged in animated conversation with the royal tutor. The princesses had adapted to palace life with surprising ease. Madison immediately immersed herself in military strategy and economics, spending hours with George's advisors and absorbing centuries of royal governance. Taylor charmed the entire court with her genuine warmth, already mediating disputes among noble children with remarkable skill. Penelope quietly explored the palace, discovering hidden passages and forgotten rooms that even longtime residents had never seen, her visions guiding her to ancient texts and artifacts of significant historical value. Together, they represented something unprecedented in Virginia's history, a true tripartite succession that combined complementary strengths rather than dividing power. 6 months after Edward's imprisonment, George called an extraordinary session of the Royal Council. The agenda contained only one item: revision of the royal succession laws. For 5 centuries, George declared to the assembled lords, Virginia has followed the tradition of a single heir, preferably male. This practice, intended to prevent succession wars, became nearly superstitious over generations. He stood tall before them, healthier than he had been in years. Yet the greatest threat to our throne came not from multiple heirs, but from the absence of them. The council murmured in agreement, still shaken by how close Edward had come to usurping the crown. Therefore, I propose a modification to our succession laws, George continued. In the extraordinary case of multiple royal births, such as the princesses Madison, Taylor, and Penelope, the throne may be shared in a triumvirate, following the ancient Roman model adapted for our modern governance. The proposal sparked intense debate. Traditionalists balked at such radical change, while progressives embraced the concept enthusiastically. After 3 days of deliberation, a compromise emerged. The triumvirate would be established, but with clearly defined spheres of responsibility for each princess. The formal document, signed by George and ratified by the council, assigned Madison oversight of military and economic affairs, Taylor responsibility for diplomacy and internal justice, and Penelope stewardship of cultural and spiritual development. Together, they would form the 3 Crowns of Virginia, a balanced governance system that combined their unique strengths. 20 years passed with remarkable swiftness, King George VI, now a wise elder statesman of 74, sat beside Eleanor on ornate thrones as the cathedral filled with nobility, foreign dignitaries, and common citizens selected by lottery to witness the historic event. Though George's hair had turned completely white, and Eleanor's copper tresses now shimmered with silver, they retained the regal bearing that had once captivated the kingdom. Before them stood their daughters, now 27, 3 identical women in appearance only. Their personalities and talents had blossomed along their designated paths, yet they remained inseparable, each completing what the others lacked. Madison, dressed in formal military attire with diplomatic medals, stood with perfect posture, her strategic mind having already modernized Virginia's defenses and trade networks during the co-regency period. Taylor wore flowing judicial robes trimmed with diplomatic symbols, her natural empathy having transformed Virginia's justice system and fostered unprecedented peace with neighboring territories. Penelope's ceremonial garments incorporated elements from Virginia's diverse spiritual traditions, reflecting her success in bridging cultural divides and preserving historical knowledge once thought lost. Today, Archbishop Williams announced to the hushed crowd, "We witness an unprecedented moment in our kingdom's history, the formal transition to the era of 3 crowns." As the ceremony reached its climax, 3 identical crowns were brought forward on velvet cushions. George rose with dignity, taking the first crown. "To Princess Madison, I entrust the crown of protection and prosperity," he proclaimed, placing it upon her head. Eleanor stood next, lifting the second crown. "To Princess Taylor, I bestow the crown of justice and harmony," she said, crowning her middle daughter. Together, the king and queen lifted the final crown. "To Princess Penelope, we confer the crown of wisdom and heritage." They spoke in unison. The moment all 3 crowns settled upon the princesses' heads, a remarkable phenomenon occurred. Penelope gasped, her eyes widening as her visionary gift manifested more powerfully than ever before. Instead of experiencing the vision alone, her sister's touch allowed her to share it with the entire cathedral. Those present later described seeing a vivid tableau of Virginia's future. 3 generations of prosperity and innovation, justice and compassion, wisdom and cultural flowering. The vision showed borders expanding peacefully, scientific advancements improving lives, and a new legal code that would blend tradition with progress in ways previously unimaginable. When the vision faded, the newly crowned triumvirate faced their kingdom together, hands clasped in unity. In his final official act, George presented each daughter with a gold medallion containing Eleanor's portrait in her youth, symbolizing that true governance came not from power, but from the capacity to love, forgive, and transform suffering into wisdom. Eleanor, with tears shimmering in her eyes, addressed the assembly. The true miracle was not merely the birth of 3 princesses against impossible odds. It was the transformation of a kingdom that learned to see strength in unity rather than division, and the healing of wounds that once seemed beyond repair. That evening, as celebrations continued throughout the capital, George added the final entry to the royal chronicle he had maintained throughout his reign. My greatest error brought my greatest redemption in seeking a single perfect heir. I almost lost the triple miracle destiny had reserved for me. I have learned that a king's true legacy lies not in the blood he transmits, but in the justice and love he nurtures, and that 3 hearts united in common purpose can achieve what 1 heart alone could never dream possible. Outside the palace windows, fireworks illuminated the night sky in brilliant tricolor patterns. The era of 3 crowns had officially begun, forever changing not just Virginia's governance, but the very concept of how power might be shared rather than divided. A living testament to how destiny can transform the greatest injustice into the most beautiful redemption.